I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm going to read from an article that I wrote in '07. It's on Toni Morrison's Beloved and this idea of scarification and rememory. The reason why I'm doing the video now is I'm about to upload a 50-plus part series on critical theory, postmodern theory, post-colonial theory, race theory, and I'm going to go more in depth on theory in that vein. I've done a substantial amount of theory already on this YouTube channel, but I'm going to take my theory in a more sort of postmodern, post-colonial, deconstructivist sort of account. So I'm going to do like the more recent trends in recent, relatively speaking, trends in theory. So with that, I wanted to use this paper as sort of a preface to the soon-to-be uploaded multi-part series on sort of critical theory and and such and others. With that being said, let's begin. It's titled "Scarification and Collective Sympathy: An Analysis of Rememory in Toni Morrison's Beloved." And again, I'll have this available for you to download. Much has been written on Toni Morrison's conception of rememory. This investigation seeks to relate her character's use of the term throughout Beloved and its interrelatedness with scarification, those inflicted by others and those self-inflicted. In addition to the analysis of this relationship, that is, between rememory and scarification, the concept of the broken slave will be discussed. It will be demonstrated that a broken slave is the ultimate representation of scarification, both for members of the slave community and within the economics of slavery. Finally, I will present and discuss the concept of collective sympathy in relation to many accounts of rememory offered throughout Beloved. On the conception of rememory and collective sympathy. In a discussion of rememory, Carolyn Rhodey writes, quote, "Rememory as trope postulates the interconnectedness of minds, past and present. It is an active creative mental function, using one's imaginative power to realize a latent abiding connection to the past. It is a trope for the problem of reimagining one's heritage." Unquote. This interconnectedness between the characters, especially Sethe, the main protagonist of the novel, and Beloved, the reincarnation of her murdered daughter, functions as a nexus of woven memories. There are two key distinctions, however, between rememory and memory. First, the divergence between memory and rememory rests in the facticity of rememory. The experience of an event or person, a building or a story, can be forgotten, but that one had such an experience is fixed. It cannot be denied, though it can be forgotten. The second key distinction rests in the intersubjectivity of rememory, which allows the characters to share in the other's suffering. It is not merely that the character remembers the brutal events of Sweet Home and 124 Bluestone, but that the characters shared in this collective experience. The interconnectedness and intersubjectivity of their shared experiences serves as a foundation for their rememory. Rememory, then, is the interrelation of shared experiences, independent to one's recollection of the experience. It is important to note, however, that we, as readers, share in the rememory of these fictional characters. Ashraf Rushdie writes, quote, "These rememories not only exist outside the agent's mind, but are available to anyone who enters the sphere of the action. Rememory is never only personal, but always interpersonal." Unquote. This interpersonal and intersubjective experience is open to everyone. That the characters of Morrison's Beloved are fictional in no way undermines the facticity of their rememory. The many atrocities described within the novel are shared memories of Morrison's readers. We have experienced Sethe's desperation at 124 Bluestone when confronted with the children's enslavement. We have been angered by the brutalization that befell Sethe at the hands of school teacher's nephew. And we have endured a psychological conflict in Beloved's return and her insistence on hearing stories Sethe had long since forgotten. In short, we have learned to sympathize through the shared rememories among Morrison's characters. To demonstrate this notion, Pinchia Feng writes, quote, "Rememory mobilizes the collective force of the community, and through the power of sympathy, free traumatized characters from the layers of repressed memories, and further empowers them to battle against imposed racial, sexual, and class oppression, unquote. The power of a sympathetic character to cross the racial divide is exemplified by Setha's interaction with Amy Denver, the young white indentured servant. After having birthed Denver, Suggs, named after the benevolent Amy Denver, the duo discuss Setha's swollen feet. Amy comments, quote, "I know a woman had her feet cut off, they was so swollen," unquote. She adds, quote, Well, I was just fishing there, and a nigga floated by me. I don't like drowned people. Your feet reminded me of him, all swollen like." What followed next, however, transcended the mere observation of Setha's swollen feet. It was not simply that Amy Denver recognized Setha's discomforting swollen feet, but that she intended on easing Setha's discomfort. Morrison writes, quote, "Then she did the magic, lifted Setha's feet and legs and massaged them until she cried salt tears." This magic is the power of sympathy, the power for the most mundane act, such as massaging someone's feet, to transcend the limitations of Setha's enslavement. Though their plight was not similar, Amy Denver understood and recognized Setha's humanity, that is, her ability to suffer. The magic, then, was encapsulated within a touch. Setha's damaged and swollen feet triggered Amy Denver's own rememories of her past, rememories of death. Thus, this scene, Morrison has juxtaposed the conflicting images of birth and death, the present and the past, the plight of the slave and the magic of a sympathetic character. Amy Denver's understanding of this magic is further demonstrated by her claim that, quote, "Anything dead coming back to life hurts," unquote. Through the indentured servant, Amy fully understands the power and interrelatedness of her rememories, and her claim that any dead coming back to life hurts is an allusion to the return of Beloved later in the novel. With respect to the conception of sympathy, Deborah Ayers Sitter writes, quote, "Morrison compels her readers to recognize Setha's dilemma, and in so doing precludes judgment and promotes sympathy. Sympathy then should follow from rememory, which is often triggered by physical and mental scars. Thus, in suggesting that one ought to sympathize with various characters presented in the novel, I am further suggesting that Morrison's conception of rememory is imbued with ethical prescriptions, allowing other sympathy to serve as a balm to the scars of slavery. Physical scarification and rememory. These scars of slavery have marred the slave population with battered bodies and shattered minds. Each scar, moreover, be it physical or mental, has a story, and each story elicits the ethical responsibility of sympathizing for the character's plight. As is often the case with severe trauma, however, many of the characters have either forgotten or suppressed their memories. Some scars remain concealed, but others, unfortunately, are housed within the flesh, marking the slave with a constant physical reminder of their suffering. Setha recounts one such scar, saying, quote, "I got a tree on my back and ain't in my house." The tree Setha is referring to is a large scar resulting from a severe beating she received while pregnant from school teacher. She accepts control of Sweet Home after the death of Mr. Garner. Setha recounts the events that preceded the beating to Paul D., a former slave and friend from Sweet Home. She says, quote, "After I left you, those boys came in there and took my milk. That's what they came in there for. Held me down and took it." In confidence, Setha told Mrs. Garner about her violations at the hand of schoolmaster's nephews. Upon discovery, however, Setha was punished for informing Mrs. Garner and beaten with cowhide after having her milk taken. Of great importance, moreover, is Setha's statement that schoolmaster made me open up my back, and when it closed, it made a tree. It grows there still. Her claim that it grows there still suggests that Setha is still suffering from the psychological trauma of having her milk taken and the violent beating she endured. Not only is the scar a continual reminder of her abuse at Sweet Home, it is the intrusion of the past into the present. It is continuous with the present. Setha's rememory of this intrusion surfaces after having sex with Paul D. She thinks to herself, quote, Men encouraged you to put some of your weight in your hands, and as soon as you felt how light and lovely that was, they studied your scar and tribulations. Thus, Seth's scar detracts from her identity, suggesting that men study it rather than her. In addition, the scar interferes with the present. It is an intrusion of the past into the present, which explains why it still grows there, or it grows there still, unquote. There is, however, another intrusion of the past which pertains to Seth's scar. It is older and more insidious than the beating she received from schoolteacher. As a child, Seth had wanted a scar of her own. At that age, she could not possibly fathom the atrocities that would befall her, but she desperately wanted to feel a connection with her mother. Her mother was simply known as Ma'am. Seth recounts the only vivid memory of her mother to Beloved, a reincarnation of her murdered child, a child murdered by her own hand, saying, quote, "Man opened up her dress front and lifted her breast and pointed under it. Right under her rib was a circle and a cross burnt right in the skin. I am the only one got this mark now. The rest dead. If something happens to me, you can't tell me by my face. You can know me by this mark." So in the event of something heinous happens to her and you can't identify me by my face, she lifts up her breast, she points to the circle and the cross, you can identify me this mark. The connection felt to her mother's brand is prevented by the institution of slavery. Seth once one also saying, "Mark me too, mark the mark on me too." The horrible truth wouldn't be revealed to Seth until she became an adult. Her mother refused to mark her and slapped her face instead. Seth notes, "I didn't understand it then, not till I had a mark of my own," the tree on her back. Thus, the physical scar, be it a brand or rabbit skin, served to initiate one's rememory of the past. Both the scar then and the rememory of the past coexist with the present. Others who bore witness to the atrocities a given character was made to endure participate in the shared rememory of that character. Though the scar may belong to another, each observer, including us as the reader, suffers with each retelling of the story. This continual reminder of one's persecution is enough to drive one mad. Such is the case for Haley Suggs. Mental scarification and the broken slave. Mr. Garner was known to boast of his ability to control his slave population. Rather than treating them like animals, he said, "My niggers is men, every one of them. But that-a-way raised that-a-way. Men, every one." Garner believed that he had to be smarter and tougher than his slaves were slaves were if he wanted. I don't know what that means. He allowed his slaves. Garner believed that he had to be smarter and tougher than his slaves if he wanted to control them. He allowed his slaves to carry guns and to marry as a gesture of confidence in his slaves, which would not have been tolerated outside Sweet Home. Unfortunately, the act of goodwill did not prepare the slaves for the reality of institutionalized slavery. Once he died, he was replaced by schoolteacher and his sadistic nephew, which devastated the slave population at Sweet Home. Just as in a quick aside, Zizek talks about this in his video on Capitalism with a Happy Face, and he talks about the institution of slavery nearing the end, and he says basically in the institution of slavery, it was the slave master who was nice to the slave that was the most dangerous, because the slave wouldn't change or want to change, have the motivation to change the institution of slavery because the master was nice. It's only those masters that were evil, diabolical to their slaves, that sort of induced the population to revolt. Miss Garner had allowed Seth to marry, and she chose Haley Suggs as her husband, but lost contact with him in her attempt to escape Sweet Home. For years, she thought Haley had abandoned her and their 4 children. In a discussion with Paul D., however, Seth discovers the truth. Paul D. says, "The day I came in here, you said they stole your milk. I never knew what it was that messed Haley up. That was it, I guess. All I knew was that something broke him." Seth is horrified to realize that Haley witnessed her humiliation at the hands of schoolteacher's nephew, saying, "He saw them boys do that to me and let them keep breathing air. He saw, he saw, he saw." Paul D. reiterates the devastation the event had on Haley's mind. "It broke him, Setha," is all he says. It is important to note that the, quote, broken slave is not the domesticated or docile slave often spoken of in discussions with Elkin's thesis. Throughout the novel, the suggestion that a slave has been broken implies that the slave has lost his mind and thereby rendered unfit for slavery. Though Setha killed Beloved, she had not been a broken slave. The narrator informs us, quote, "Other people went crazy. Why couldn't she? Other people's brains stopped, turned around to something new, which is what must have happened to Haley," unquote. In her discussion of Setha's murder of Beloved, Jana Fuston White writes, quote, "It was not madness, but the reality of slavery that drove Setha to kill her child, fully aware of the act and its brutality as well as its compassion," unquote. Setha's rage resulted from an understanding of the horrors of slavery, rather from her descent into madness. Hope was not a luxury any slave could afford, and Setha knew too well that though she could hope for the well-being of her child, the grim reality was that they too would have suffered as she had. This refutation of the future of hope is exemplified in the discussion between Setha and Denver. Quote, "Maybe we should unbraid it," asked Setha. Tomorrow." Denver crouched forward at the thought of a fine-tooth comb pulling her hair. "Today is always here," said Setha. "Tomorrow, never." Later in the novel, the concept of an empty hope returns when Paul D. recounts the psychological trauma he received while in Georgia. Though he bore no physical scars, the effects of the chain gang scarred him for life. He says, quote, They killed the flirt whom folks called life for leading them on, making them think the next sunrise would be worth it, and another stroke of time would do it at last. Only when she was dead would they be safe," unquote. Setha places importance on today rather than tomorrow because, as she said, being alive was the hard part. Her distinction between the harsh reality of her everyday life and the false hope of freedom and family is mirrored by Paul D.'s allegorical language. The sunrise ushers the hope for tomorrow, only to realize, however, that tomorrow brings the same tribulations as those previously endured in the past. These rememories are shared across a nexus of despair. For Setha and Paul D., their lives are lived either in the past or in the present, but never in the future. They have survived where so many others have died, namely the 5 other Sweet Home Men and Beloved, because their insistence to remain focused on the present. Thus, the language of hope within the economics of institutionalized slavery bears enough heft to crush the spirit of the most resilient slave. A broken slave, then, is the ultimate representation of scarification, both for members of the slave community and within the economics of slavery. The broken slave and the economics of slavery. Specific to the economics of slavery, the broken slave is worthless. In recounting the murder of Beloved, the narrator informs us that, quote, "Unlike a snake or a bear, a dead nigger could not be skinned for profit and was not worth his own dead weight in coin." Setha understood that, for a school teacher, her children were only valuable insofar as they were fit for labor. It's very important. To render them unfit for labor meant they had no value, which is not to say they were without intrinsic value. That is, not the value given to human life as such. They were robbed of their instrumental value. Setha's children, all slaves for that matter, were only valuable insofar as their free labor produced a product that could be sold for profit. A slave was property that reproduced itself without cost. No one understood this better than Setha. Mary Elliott discusses this conception in terms of commodified subjectivity. She writes, quote, A post-colonial analysis of Beloved helps us read Setha's self-actualization as a resistance, as a resistive process against objectifying colonial definitions of black identity, which served to recontextualize Setha's motivations for murdering her child, the subsequent ostracism by her community, her obsessive love for Beloved, and her final release from the ideological confines of colonial commodification, unquote. This release from the, quote, confines of colonial commodification is a revolutionary act against the established power relations between the institution of slavery and the slave. In refusing to submit to the oppressive powers of institutionalized slavery, Setha acts as a revolutionary. Her resistance to this power is therefore also an act of power. Thus, the dynamics of power and resistance on the one hand, the commodification of self-actualization on the other, creates the necessary conditions wherein Setha can justify her act of infanticide as an act of love. This power dynamic is discussed by Michel Foucault, who writes, quote, "Where there is power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather, consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. Should it be said that one is always inside power, there is no escaping it. There is no absolute outside where it is concerned," unquote. When schoolteacher arrives at 124 Bluestone and realizes that Setha has attempted to take the lives of her children, he assumes she has gone crazy. She's been broken. The narrator informs us, quote, "But now she'd gone wild due to the mishandling of the nephew who'd overbeaten her and made her cut and run. Setha, however, had not gone wild. She loved her 4 children and would sooner kill them than give them to schoolteacher. But we are told, quote, the whole lot was lost now. 5. Schoolteacher realizes that Setha too is unfit for labor. The broken slave is too scarred, thereby clipping the economy of slavery. Setha and her 4 children were useless, that is, without instrumental value, forcing schoolteacher to leave empty-handed. Setha truly believed that dying was easy, that being alive was the hard part. Thus, her love for her children afforded them an easy death rather than a hard life. This conception of love, however, was scrutinized in a conversation with Paul D. The narrator notes, quote, This here Setha talked about love like any other woman, talked about baby clothes like any other woman, but what she meant could cleave bone. This here Setha talked about safety with a handsaw. More important than what Setha had done was what she claimed. Granted, Setha attempted to kill her children while claiming she loved them, but Paul D. disapproves. He says, "Your love is too thick." To which Setha replied, "Love is or ain't. Thin love ain't love at all." The economics of slave labor could not exercise force over Setha's love for her children. Setha would not yield her love to this force because she recognized that her children were more than just instruments of labor. Setha tells Paul D., quote, "When I stretched out my arms, all my children could get in between. I was that wide. Looked like I loved them more than I got here. Or maybe I couldn't love them proper in Kentucky because they wasn't mine to love, because they were property. But when I got here, then I jumped down off the wagon and wasn't nobody in the world couldn't love if I wanted to." Schoolteacher would never attribute such high-order thinking to a nigger, much less a woman. The institution of slavery blinded him to the complexities of Setha's mind. Setha truly understood the profundity of slave labor and recognized that, quote, "Love is or ain't. That is, if one's love is unconditional, then infanticide is justified insofar as it protects and secures her children from a lifetime of pain and suffering. Her love then defeated the oppressive forces of institutionalized slavery by keeping her children safe from a lifetime of subjugation." Collective sympathy and the process of healing. Freedom can present its own difficulties in a community of freed slaves. Morrison explores this building tension as it takes shape at 124 Bluestone when Suther arrives. A large meal was prepared, food for 90, which made many members of the community jealous. The narrator explains, quote, "It made them furious. They swallowed baking soda the morning after to calm the stomach violence caused by the bounty, the reckless generosity on display at 124, whispered to each other in the yards about fat rats, doom, and uncalled for pride. Baby Suggs was simply a generous woman. She harbored no ill intent with her celebration, but members of the community resented her for what she was afforded. Though the freed slaves of Cincinnati, Ohio, were beyond the oppressive forces of institutionalized slavery, they were still psychologically conditioned for self-destruction. As the late Bob Marley said, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." Baby Suggs realized that if Suther were to move beyond slavery, if she was to embrace the present and the possibility of tomorrow, she would have to, quote, lay it all down. The narrator adds, quote, "Suther was trying to take her advice, to lay it all down, sword and shield, not just to acknowledge the advice Baby Suggs gave her, but actually to take it," unquote. Suther could not progress forward. She could not begin to live her life were she to dwell on the hardships of her past, and so she acted. We are told, quote, "Anybody feeling sorry for her, anybody wandering by to peep in and see how she was getting on, including Paul D., would discover that the woman junk-heaped for the third time because she loved her children. The woman was sailing happily on a frozen creek. 2 paces onto that creek, she lost her balance and landed on her behind. The girls, screaming with laughter, joined her on the ice. Suther was determined to begin her process of healing, of making amends for the desperate slaughter of her daughter and the trauma endured under the institution of slavery. I disagree with many others who claim that her self-actualization and the result of her psychological torment required Paul D.'s assertion that, quote, "You your best thing, Suther, you are." Suther recognized this fact independent to Paul D.'s assertion, which is evident in the fact that she, of her own volition, decided to, quote, "lay it all down, sword and shield." On the ice skating with her daughters, Suther is finally able to laugh. She has begun the process of healing in recognizing that only she can control her life. Control is not only measured in what an individual is able to attain, but what one is willing to sacrifice. We are told that, quote, "The pain was unbearable when they ran low on food and Denver watched her mother go without, pick-eating around the edge of the table and stove. 124 Bluestone was preparing to devour Suther. Without intervention, she would surely have died. The problem, however, was that members of the community still harbored a twofold resentment for Suther. They were jealous of Baby Suggs' flamboyant generosity when she was living and were infuriated by Suther's murder of Beloved. Denver took the initiative to seek employment, as Suther was growing sicker with the passing of each day. After hearing of Suther's condition, Lady Jones, a school teacher, quote, "gave Denver some rice, 4 eggs, and some tea." Despite her generosity, however, Suther's condition worsened. Denver sought help from Bodwin's sympathetic abolitionists, but needed to convince their maid, Janie, that her mother was in dire circumstance. Despite Denver's initial reluctance, she told Janie everything. Quote, "It was a little thing to pay, but it seemed big to Denver. Nobody was going to help her unless she told all of it. It was clear Janie wouldn't let her see the Bodwins otherwise." After hearing the story, the news that Janie got hold of, she spared among the other colored women. I'm not sure what that says. That's like a quote from the book, but I probably misquoted it. Finally, we are told that, quote, "It was Ella more than anyone who convinced the others to rescue, that rescue was in order. Because of Denver's initiative, the community was sympathetic to Sympathy's dilemma, and they decided to act on her behalf. Mr. Bodwin's arrival, specifically his hat and masked face, triggered Sympathy's memory of schoolteacher attempting to collect her children. Morrison uses nearly the same language to describe Sympathy's state of mind in both cases. Quote, Sympathy saw them coming and recognized schoolteacher's hat. She heard wings, little hummingbirds stuck their needle breaks right through her headcloth into her hair and beating their wings. And if she thought anything, it was no, 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 no. Simple. She just flew. Guiding the mare slowly down his back, guiding the mare slowly down, his black hat, wide-brimmed enough to hide his face, but not his purpose. He is coming into her yard, and he is coming for the best thing. She hears wings, little hummingbirds stick needles, breaks right through her headcloth into her hair and beating their wings. And if she thinks anything, it is no, 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 no. She flies. The ice pick is not in her hand. It is her hand. The ice pick is not in her hand. It is her hand. The circumstances, however, were drastically different. Though Sympathy may have been justified in the murder of Beloved, were she to kill Mr. Bodwin, she would surely have been a broken slave. Denver's initiative, coupled with the collective sympathy of the community, saved Sympathy from utter insanity. She was a woman on the brink of madness, on the brink of murder, on the brink of complete self-annihilation. But the communal intervention offers hope for tomorrow. For the time being, however, Sympathy desperately needed to rest. And I think that's it. That's it. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to the paper. Thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Goodbye.